Many Eastern teachings speak about the body and the mind, and this is the arena in which the ego is described as manifesting itself internally in the form of thoughts and feelings, which would comprise the mind, and sensations in the body. When you read the literature, a lot of this is what it talks about, understanding what the body and mind are, that they are not consciousness, and that this is where consciousness forms as the ego. And that's about as far as those teachings often go. So when you observe yourself to try to understand what you're seeing, it's in terms of mind and body. And as we'll see in the next slide, the fourth way draws a more distinct picture of what the mind actually is, what the body is, and how we can observe it in more specific terms. The fourth way breaks the mind down, not down, but it describes the mind as comprising two parts, which are quite independent from one another. One is the intellectual center, which is the home of all of our thoughts, concepts, ideas, where we gather data, form opinions, that sort of thing. And then the emotional center, which is the home of our emotions, our feelings, some of our deeper, more full-blown attitudes and beliefs. And one reason this is important, this distinction, is our thoughts operate very slowly. The intellectual center, according to the fourth way, is the slowest of our four centers. This is why we speak slowly. We experience a thought more slowly than, say, a flurry of emotions, which can sweep over us in an instant and have quite a powerful effect. At the same time, the fourth way distinguishes the body as two separate centers independent of each other, the moving center and the instinctive center. The instinctive center being all of our bodily sensations, our physiology, all the things we're born as an infant who sneezes and coughs and cries and perspires and everything. In this sense, the instinctive center takes care of itself. The moving center is all the learned movements. We learn how to walk, how to type, how to ride a bicycle, how to handle tools, things like that. And although the instinctive and moving centers work closely hand in hand, they are distinct from one another and very distinct from the emotional and the intellectual centers. This becomes the basis. Intellectual center, emotional center, moving center, and instinctive center form the basis for self-observation in the fourth way. And it is the same as the Eastern traditions in the sense of the ego. The ego forms itself out of all the impulses that arise from the four centers because consciousness identifies with those impulses. And then it takes the form of the ego. But in the fourth way, this is called imaginary I, or imaginary picture of oneself, or in some instances, false personality. It's an image we develop inside our minds of who we are, and then we project that outward into the world in the form of behavior. For those of you who are familiar with Gurdjieff's analogy of a driver, a horse, and a carriage, this depicts the four centers in relation to each other, where the intellectual center could be seen as the driver, the emotional center as the horse, the moving center, and the instinctive center together as the carriage. You can think of the instinctive center as the wagon and the moving center as the wheels. They do operate in tandem. One can't really operate without the other. And they are connected, and the lines you see there at the bottom is meant to demonstrate the connection between those two centers. And similarly, there's a connection between the moving center and the emotional center. As there is in a wagon when the horse is hitched up to it, there's a pretty elaborate harness that allows the horse to pull the cart or carriage. And similarly, the driver, the intellectual center, is connected to the emotional center, the horse, by the means of reins. In normal situations, the driver tries to steer the horse and guide the horse, which then guides the wagon or the carriage. Although, as you know, the emotional center can run away with us at times, can overwhelm the mind, And it would be like the driver losing control of the reins and the horse just going wherever it wants willy-nilly and running off with us. This diagram is a depiction of taking just one center. It can represent any of the four centers, but it's meant to show that, according to the fourth way, each center has in turn four parts. So, for example, the intellectual center has an intellectual part. It also has an emotional part. It also has a moving part and an instinctive part. And each of these operate quite differently. In the case of the intellectual center, information would be stored in different parts. Our ability to organize information, organize thoughts, would be more in the intellectual part. Our interest in ideas, passion for ideas, would occupy more the emotional part of the intellectual center. And each of these parts, just as with the centers themselves, operates at a slightly different speed with a slightly different fuel. And again, this is a depiction of each center would have four distinct parts, and this is just a further breakdown of how we can observe in ourselves, or learn to observe in ourselves, where impulses are coming from, how they're leading to thoughts, how that's guiding our behavior. And this is showing that, in fact, each center, again, if you just take one center, has a positive and a negative half. And that's true for each part within the center. So the intellectual part, the emotional part, the moving part, the instinctive part, each have a positive and a negative half. In the case of the intellectual center, it's yes and no, or black and white, good and bad, and so forth. It's a very rigid form of thinking that can happen. In the emotional center, it's like and dislike, approve and disapprove, believe or not believe. In the moving part of a center, or in the moving center, I should say, it'd be more movement and the lack of movement, up and down, left and right. And in the instinctive center, pleasant and unpleasant sensations or tastes, safe or unsafe, comfortable and uncomfortable, and so forth. But again, just to show, fourth way breaks all this down much more concretely. And so you can see that here, in one center, you could have 8 different parts, each of them generating different impulses in us, which influences the way we think and feel and behave. And this shows even a further breakdown, a final breakdown, whereby each part of each center now has 4 parts of its own, with a positive and negative half. So you would now have, let's say, the moving center, and it would have an intellectual part, an emotional part, a moving part, and an instinctive part, and each of those would have an intellectual part, an emotional part, a moving part, an instinctive part. You can see in a way the simplicity of the fourth way language, terminology. And we could say quite simply that an intellectual part of a center and the intellectual part of that part operates with the most attention, whereas the moving part and the moving part of that part operates with little or no attention, or uncontrolled attention. You need attention in the moving center when you learn how to ride a bike. But once you learn, you no longer need that level or quality of attention. You can now just ride a bike without thinking about it. It happens by itself almost with little or no attention. So now that activity has passed from the intellectual part of a center to the moving part. So there are many nuances here, and you can see when we're done, you have actually now 32, if you take into account the positive and negative half of each center, you have 32 places or origins from which sensations, thoughts, emotions, and movement can arise. And the fourth way enables us to learn how to observe ourselves quite carefully and see that what we normally feel as I is coming from one of these 32, or to keep it more simple, one of these 16 places in ourselves. And this becomes excellent material that becomes easily verifiable in ourselves. And brings us to a level where self-observation becomes more of a conscious activity. And in the next set of slides, in part 2 of this, we'll look more carefully at how the centers work together.